So from the cochlea, information is going to travel along the cochlear division of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 8. The spiral ganglion cells that are located within the spiral cochlea are the cells whose axons are going to form that nerve, and they're going to meet up with the fibers coming from the vestibular apparatus to form the cochlear and the vestibular divisions of the 8th cranial nerve, which will work its way into the brain stem. And this 8th cranial nerve, the cochlear division, the auditory division, is going to first synapse in what's known as the cochlear nuclei that are localized in the brainstem. And from the cochlear nuclei, there's going to be projections into a structure that's called the superior olive. That means, of course, there is also an inferior olive. When you cut it, it looks kind of like an olive. And then from the superior olive, there's going to be projections up to what are called the inferior colliculi, which are bumps on the dorsal surface or back surface of the brainstem, just below the superior colliculi, which, remember, are very important for visual orienting reflexive responses. And from the inferior colliculi, there are projections up, of course, to the thalamus. And remember that vision, is going to be processed by a nucleus known as the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, the little knee to the side that the thalamus is kneeling on, while the medial geniculate nuclei are actually processing auditory information before sending information on to primary auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobes, right by that lateral fissure, sort of extending medially along the planum temporale, the top plane of the temporal lobe. There's a gyrus called Heschel's gyrus there, and that's primary auditory cortex, or A1. Now, in comparison with vision, right, there's a lot of sharing of information, from one ear and the other across, the brainstem, well before you get to cortex. And that's very unlike vision, where, remember, everything on the right side of visual space is going to end up on the left primary visual cortex and occipital lobe. Everything on the left visual space, visual hemifield, ends up on the right, primary visual cortex, before there's crossing at what's called the corpus callosum. But in the case of audition, there's sharing at earlier levels, and that allows for sort of reflexive kind of sound localization to some extent. The superior olive, for example, is where information that's shared across the hemispheres allows us to sort of extract, which direction a sound may be coming from. For sounds of less than 1,000 hertz, we're typically talking about, the difference in terms of interoral, what's called time difference, like when the compression wave, for example, arrives at this ear versus that ear. If the sound's coming from over here, it'll hit this ear before it hits this ear, so we can compare its arrival time, between the two ears at the level of the superior olive, and extract, directional information of where it's coming from. But for sounds over 1,000 hertz, actually, it's hitting both ears pretty much simultaneously because it's coming so quickly. In that case, we use actually the fact that our head casts a shadow, a sound shadow. And so there can be what they call an interoral level distance, difference, or, intensity difference between the two ears that can help us to, localize where sounds are coming from. Interestingly, in the 180 degrees in front of us, we tend not to be all that good at sound localization in the absence of visual input, because we kind of look around for the likely sources of where the sound may be coming from, but we're much better, in the 180 degrees behind us, where we're not expecting to get visual input. There's a neuroscientist, Alex Stevens, up at OHSU, who did, some research on those who were blind since birth, and they have, very good sound localization abilities, all 360 degrees around them. The last kind of thing I'd like to emphasize is that in this transition from the cochlea, through the cochlear nuclei, the superior olive, the inferior colliculi, the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and then into temporal lobe. Remember, there's much more of the basilar membrane in the cochlea is devoted to frequencies that are associated with human speech, some of these lower frequency sounds. And that tonotopic organization, that frequency organization, is maintained at every level, of this central network that's transiting the input from the ears up ultimately to areas of the temporal lobe that allow us to perceive it. In fact, the columnar organization of primary auditory cortex is based upon the frequencies of sound, and there are far more columns, far more cortical columns that are devoted to parsing fine details between lower frequency sounds that are behaviorally relevant to us than the really, for example, high frequency sounds that we're going to perceive as very high pitched, like mosquito sounding tones, right?